5. How to drive the Peppercorn Class A1 462 Pacific locomotive number 60163 Tornado. Driver Bob Death sounded his whistle, pulled gently on the handle of his regulator, and eased the massive Merchant Navy steam locomotive 35008 Orient Line out of London's Waterloo Station en route to Southampton, hauling the day's boat train. To our 21st century imagination, fuddled by misty-eyed nostalgia for the glory of the steam era, this is an image of sunny and gleaming loveliness, of supreme dignity made machine, proud and polished. But it didn't seem that way at the time. The year was 1967, the month July, and the final demise of mainline British steam traction was but a year away. The once cheered Merchant Navy had become a ruin of an engine, filthy, clapped out, unloved, minimally maintained, and operating under the shadow cast by the scrapman's cutting torch, which had already dispatched much of Britain's 20,000-strong steam locomotive fleet. The Merchant Navy clanked defiantly southwards. Clear of London's conurbation and its speed limits, the crew coaxed it onwards, stoking its ravaged boiler mercilessly. Doubtless it leaked a bit. The bearings of wheels and motion work were terminally worn out. An Orient Line had been kept in service only by cannibalising those of its sisters already in the scrapyard. Yet somehow, somewhere along the journey, this neglected heap of anachronistic ironmongery hit 102 miles an hour. This was such a bold, audacious and frankly foolhardy driving exploit that it is still recounted in reverential tones whenever old railwaymen meet. Driver Death was 28 years old. A few decades earlier, the idea of such a lad driving a top-link express locomotive would have been unthinkable. Their drivers were usually 50-year-old veterans, occupying a position of great prestige and commanding hard-earned respect. This is why, in A.P. Thompson's famous 1932 poster advertising the Flying Scotsman service from London, the driver is placed high up in a stylised engine given the proportions of a church, and the awestruck onlooker on the platform is diminished to a few feet in height. But by 1967, the veterans were firmly ensconced in the comfortable cabs of diesel-electric engines, such as the Deltic and Class 47, relieved to be free, finally, of the squalor of the steam footplate. Death's fledgling presence on the Merchant Navy was a testament to the low estimation in which steam locomotives had come to be held. In brutally analytical terms, steam in Britain outstayed its welcome by at least a decade. The first Clean Air Act of 1956 had identified steam traction as one of the sources of the choking pea super that had killed 8,000 of London's inhabitants in the Great Smog of 1952. It is said that you cannot stand anywhere in the British Isles and be more than 100 miles from the sea. There was a time when you could not stand anywhere in the British Isles and be out of earshot of the whistle of a steam train, and with the whistle came the muck. Coal firing of steam engines, the domestic hearth and suburban power stations were why buildings we now know in their cleaned-up form, such as the Albert Hall and Westminster Abbey, used to be black. The post-war desire for modernity increasingly embraced clean, efficient and convenient internal combustion, not just on the railways, but in the ominous and ever more accessible family car. Steam seemed like a Victorian hangover. Even a decade before Death's exploit, steam power did not sit well with the image of high glamour rail travel could sometimes muster. Passengers in the Pullman coaches of the Atlantic Coast Express in the 1950s enjoyed sumptuous upholstery, exquisite marquetry panels, tasselled curtains, individual ornate table lamps, and fine dining from crisp linen, served by sharply pressed staff. In such surroundings, it would have been difficult to comprehend the medieval toil being endured by the crew hauling them, the constant fug of coal dust blown up from the tender, the heat, the all-pervading grease, the brutal bucking of the crudely sprung locomotive, and, when an incline beckoned, the inferno's demand for offerings of coal as fast as a stout man could wield a shovel. In an era when showers were virtually unknown to working men, and even baths were rare, the grime of locomotive operation would have stayed in the pores for a working lifetime, and cleanliness was a goal of retirement. Steam locomotives were dirty, woefully inefficient, temperamental, expensive to run, time-consuming to prepare for work, and satanic in their demands on men. When the end finally came, few people who had worked them for a living mourned their passing. And yet, time has cleaned the image of steam for us, as surely as it cleaned the smut-caked facades of famous stations. Viewed through the filter of sentiment and held by the brasso and fresh paint of conservationists, the steam locomotive seems like a lost expression of grandeur and everyday pomp, its driver and firemen like gleeful boys given a giant train set to play with. The steam locomotive lingers in the popular imagination like no other obsolete machine. It helps that the classic steam engineman's pose, elbow jutting from the cab, soot-streaked face peering out and vignetted by a cloud of spent steam, one hand on the whistle, is the most manful that man ever struck. Dr. Johnson told us that every man thinks meanly of himself for not having been a soldier. But steam locomotives hadn't been invented then. Today, many of us feel faintly inadequate when measured against a chap whose gnarly hands have ministered to metal dragons. Now, though, this failing can be redressed. The call of the footplate is louder today than it has been for 2 generations of railway working. The heritage railway movement has gained more momentum than a runaway train, and the number of restored steam locomotives continues to grow. Steam is now once again seen regularly on the main line, and simple extrapolations suggest that, eventually, those organisations that stoke our innate fascination with the age of steam will eventually join up and serve the whole country. And why not? Historic railways are the best run railways in Britain, not least because they're the work of people who actually like trains. The greatest irony is this. One of the newest locomotives running on British metals is number 60163 Tornado, an A1 Pacific of 1947 design, but built from scratch by enthusiasts over a 19-year period and first steamed in 2008. This may be the future. We may need more drivers for steam trains. Add to that renewed interest in holidaying in Britain, and the wise man will realise that he must be ready when the regulator beckons, and 13 carriages full of excitable families are trusting his steady hand to haul them safely and happily to the seaside. Should you find yourself in this position, here is what you need to know. Steam technology, despite the 200-plus years of refinement manifested in a modern engine like Tornado, is essentially an 18th century affair. Please do not write in to remind me of the work of Hero, Savory et al. Or later developments in the steam turbine field by Parsons. I know, I'm talking about reciprocating piston steam engines, as pioneered by James Watt. It is, therefore, readily understood. In reality, the steam engine is powered by coal, which is used to heat water inside a sealed boiler to create steam at high pressure. The boiler is a bit more than just a hollow barrel with a fire under one end. Boiler tubes, as pioneered by Stephenson on his rocket, transfer the hot gases from the firebox through the boiler to the chimney, thereby dramatically increasing the surface area exposed to the water. This is why the firebox is at one end and the chimney at the other. You might wonder why the crew work at the back of the engine, when the view would be so much better from the front. Technically, they could work from the front, but where would you put the supplies of fresh coal and water? They have to go in the tender, which would now have to be pushed in front rather than towed behind, exposing the crew to even more coal dust at speed and making visibility even worse, and it's already pretty poor. Small tank engines, which carry their coal in an integral bunker and their water in tanks around the boiler, can run happily in both directions. The steam collects at the highest point of the boiler, the steam dome, and from there is directed via the regulator to the cylinders, where it acts on pistons and pushes them back and forth inside their cylinders. Pedants will want me to point out that it's slightly more involved than that, because steam from the dome also passes through a superheater, a further arrangement of hot tubes that dries out the wet or saturated steam and increases its temperature and hence pressure, with obvious benefits to performance. The piston's reciprocating motion is converted via rods and cranks to rotary motion at the wheels. At the same time, other cranks and offsets operate more rods to work the valves, controlling the flow of fresh steam to and exhaust steam from the cylinders, and in a way that is geometrically baffling to anyone not descended directly from Euclid. The exhaust steam from the cylinders is directed up the chimney through something known as the blast pipe. This creates a partial vacuum in the boiler tubes and draws a draft through the firebox. This invigorates the hot coals and, almost as importantly, prevents the fire from blowing back into the cab and incinerating the fireman. More of this later. Tornado's 3 cylinders are double-acting, meaning that, unlike in a car engine, the pistons are driven in both directions. When the engine pulls away from rest, you will therefore hear 6 distinct exhaust chuffs for every revolution of the driving wheels. During high-speed running, they will blur almost seamlessly into one glorious and continuous chuff that goes on for miles and bloody miles, and it's right grand and all. In my mind, all steam enthusiasts are from Lancashire, probably because of Fred Dibner. It might seem surprising that the stuff coming from the spout of your kettle can take 600 tons of train from rest to 100 miles an hour, but that's because it's not the same stuff. What you can see coming from the kettle and being exhausted through the locomotive's chimney is actually water vapour, which is partly condensed steam. Superheated steam exists at around 350 degrees C, is completely invisible, and would probably shatter your teapot. There are 3 basic controls used in driving the locomotive, although you shouldn't let that fool you into thinking it's in any way simple. They are the regulator. This controls the amount of steam being fed to the cylinders. It's a sort of throttle. The further you pull it out, the more steam you get. The screw reverser. This is a bit more esoteric. Rotating this alters the geometric relationship between the movement of the pistons and the movement of the valves, affecting something called steam cutoff. Cutoff is the point in the piston's stroke when the inlet valve closes. Late cutoff provides more grunt and is used for pulling away and climbing gradients, but as steam continues to expand after the valve is closed, is wasteful of energy. Early cutoff introduces just a whiff of steam at the beginning of a piston's stroke and is used when running, when only a small amount of power is needed to keep the train going. Positions in between the 2 extremes will be used for acceleration and climbing gradients. Think in terms of pushing a broken-down car. You have to push very hard to get it rolling. That's late cut-off. But once it's going, you can relax a bit. Early cut-off. The reverser's setting is indicated on the gleaming brass sector plate. It works in both directions, and cut-off is expressed as a percentage from 0 to 75. With the pointer in the middle, the valves are at mid-gear, and the engine will not run in either direction. Intelligent use of the reverser is the key to efficient running and saving the labours of your long-suffering but uncomplaining firemen. The train brake. On Tornado, this is a departure from original 1940s A1 practice, being a modern air brake. It applies all the wheel brakes on the train and is a proportional control, so the further you turn the handle, the harder the brakes are applied. Those are the basic going and stopping controls. You will also need to understand the following, otherwise, despite Tornado's apparent invincibility, you will quickly break it. And then the people who spent almost 2 decades building it will fire the boiler with your battered corpse and lubricate their crosshead slides with your molten fat. The sight glasses. These indicate the level of the water in the boiler. Because the water splashes around in the boiler under acceleration or braking, these require interpretation rather than mere reading. In any case, allowing the boiler to run dry will cause it to either buckle or explode. Watch them carefully, and if they look in any way low, slake the beast's prodigious thirst with the injectors. These are complex steam pumps that force fresh water from the tender into the boiler. The one on the left is driven by live steam, but the more economical one on the right is driven by exhaust steam, but only when the locomotive is under power. Turn anti-clockwise to open. They will only work if the tender water valves are open. And finally, the cylinder drain cock lever. This opens valves on the cylinders to release condensed water that may have collected while stationary. Open after coming to a halt and close after pulling away. So, for a run from London's King's Cross to York with 13 coaches, you will need 7.5 tonnes of coal in the tender, 6,200 gallons of water, also in the tender, plus another 1,500 gallons in the boiler. Even then a watering stop will be required, and unfortunately it works out at Grantham. A large can of lubricating oil. A fellow of good character and build, to act as your fireman. Before starting to build the fire, first ensure that the locomotive is properly parked. Locomotive and tender brakes applied, reverser in the mid-gear position, regulators shut, cylinder drain cocks open. Historically, steam engines have been known to set off by themselves during the steaming up process, and as Tornado weighs 165 tons with a full tender, you will not be able to stop it by applying your shoulder to a buffer. So, as an added precaution, hang the "Not to be moved" sign on the side of the cab. That'll stop it. Your fireman can now start building the fire, but first we'll have to remove the remains of the previous one. First, he must open the hopper under the ashpan using the lever on the outside. He can also open the damper door using the lever on the inside. He can manipulate the rocking grate to dislodge clinker, and he can even shovel the bigger bits back out and throw them through the cab door. But eventually, he will have to crawl under the engine and chip away the stubborn stuff using a fire iron. He will emerge looking like some sort of Neanderthal bog dweller. From coal, the fire is built like a scout bonfire. Start with diesel-soaked rags, cardboard and bits of wood, and gradually add coal until you have an even, brightly glowing covering over the grate. This is around 1/4 of a ton. Keep going. While all this is going on, you, as driver, can see to lubrication. All the small oilers must be filled and oil dribbled into the holes at the bearings. Also wipe a layer of oil onto the crosshead slides, and yet more onto the connecting and coupling rods to protect them from rust. Wipe oil all over your face. You're going to end up looking like that anyway, and it has excellent moisturising properties. Now an inspector must be summoned to make a fitness to run report. He will crawl around and underneath, shining a torch into corners and hitting things. He's looking for leaks, cracks and loose bits. He may find the fireman. Assuming he gives the engine a clean ticket, then it is a simple matter of waiting for the boiler to reach its working pressure of 250 pounds per square inch. If starting from coal and being kind to the engine, this could take a day. Everything you have heard so far is mere theory. A steam locomotive cannot be driven entirely by the book. They have always been hand-built in series rather than strictly mass-produced, so not only is every type different, but every example of every type is different and will behave differently on different days. Steam locomotives have foibles and attitude, like teenagers. They must be felt and understood at a visceral level. In any case, steam locomotives are driven by two men, the driver and the fireman, and a unique and apparently psychic avenue of communication must exist between them. Engine driving is almost a folk tradition. It is learned by example, and knowledge is spread by law in engine sheds and line-side bothies. It is an occult art that comes up through the boots of blokes, and you cannot hope to know it immediately. That said, you may be able to make a fair stab at it if you concentrate. The most important thing to understand is this. If you drive a car, you will be used to making almost instant responses to the requirement to accelerate, brake, or change down to climb a hill. However, on a steam train, everything takes an age. It takes time for the steam to reach the cylinders when you open the regulator, and it keeps working for a while after you close it. It takes time for the brakes of 13 coupled coaches to clamp on, and they take their time about coming off again. Speed takes an age to build. Stopping distances at any decent speed are measured in multiples of 1/4 of a mile. Steam cannot be made instantly. If coasting downhill under a speed limit but approaching a climb, the fireman might need to shovel madly even though the regulator is closed, in anticipation of demand. A huge amount of forward planning is required, and this is why a special bond must exist between the two men on the footplate. There's no point trying to do this with someone argumentative. Check that the boiler pressure gauge reads somewhere near 250 pounds per square inch, that the brakes are on, the reverser is in mid-gear with the cylinder drain cocks open. Pull the regulator gently and blow the cylinders through for a few seconds. If you are starting from a mainline siding or station, you will be at a starter signal. When it turns green, wind the reverser to full forward cut-off, release the brakes, don't forget the tender, open the blower, sound the whistle, and give the regulator a small tug. You are looking for a reading of between 50 and 60 on the cylinder pressure gauge. Now shut the regulator again. The steam will continue to expand as the pistons start to move. The locomotive will creak as the drawbar between the footplate and tender is stretched. You will move forward minutely, as yet unaccompanied by any new steam engine sound beyond the ones Tornado was making while it was simmering at rest. Give the regulator another short burst to keep that cylinder pressure constant. Be patient, or the wheels might spin. The train is moving. Just. At some point, any second now, you will arrive at a spiritual high point in your life. You will be rewarded with something so deeply moving that it will froth your blood and make your lungs feel bigger, something the memory of which will return to cheer you in old age and melancholy. Your first chuff. Congratulations, you have just popped your steam locomotive driving cherry. Fortifying chuffs will now come regularly and rhythmically like a jackpot from some weird one-armed bandit of the soul. You can leave the regulator cracked open, but shut the cylinder drain cocks. You may be moving at something like 1 mile an hour, and the world will be shrouded in vast billowing clouds of exhaust steam. This looks great, and has the added advantage of obscuring from view all the disturbing-looking railway enthusiasts who have turned out to watch your departure. Soon you may be doing 5 miles per hour, and suddenly your earlier euphoria will be displaced by the terrifying sensation that nearly 700 tons of mainline express train is running away with you. Remain calm. Sound the whistle again. Meanwhile, your fireman will be ready to feed the open door to Hades. Firing the engine is not a simple matter of shoveling in coal like a navvy. The grate must be totally covered, which means balletic spadework to throw the coal to left and right, to the back or just behind the firebox door. A good fireman will move more like a fencer than a mere stoker. He will understand the difference between primary air, drawn through the fire from under the grate by opening the damper door, and secondary air, drawn over the fire through the firebox door, their effect on burning and steam production, the character of coal, and other things that make him a high priest at the altar of combustion. Firemen seem to say little, but know everything. The fireman should always watch the sight glasses and be ready to top up the boiler. He should also consider the boiler pressure gauge. For starting off, full pressure of 250 pounds per square inch is needed, but if approaching a stopping station, it isn't. There's no point in building Dante's Inferno just before coming to a lengthy halt, because the pressure will climb too high and the steam will blow off through the safety valves, which means all his effort has manifested itself as an annoying noise and a light poaching of any train spotters on nearby bridges. If the fireman is good, the coal will burn completely and will last longer. A glance at the chimney when cruising is a good indicator of his performance. If the smoke is black and oily, the engine is effectively running rich, and energy in the coal is being wasted. A leaned out and efficient engine produces ethereal, wispy grey smoke. Tornado is now gathering yet more speed. Keep opening the regulator and start to wind the reverser back to earlier cut-off. Refer to the cylinder pressure gauge and aim for a constant reading. With 25 miles per hour on the speedo, something like 45% cut-off should be roughly right, but really this is a matter of feel. Amazingly, your bones will detect the faintest hint of acceleration or retardation, even if it's a gain or loss of just 1 mile an hour in a minute. This is your best guide. You might like to think about what to do if you need to stop. Fortunately, modern railway signalling is a bit like road traffic lights in that there are 3 colours to worry about: red, yellow and green. Most modern signals are 4-aspect, meaning there are 2 yellow lights between the red and the green. The other difference is that because a train at speed could take up to 3/4 of a mile to bring to a complete stop, the light sequence is spread out along the line. Railways work to something called the block section system. In simple terms, the line is divided into sections, and a train may only enter a section if the previous train has left it. A green light means that the next 3 sections at least are clear. The automatic warning system will sound a cheery bell, and its circular display will remain black. More regulator. More coal. As the speed limit of 75 miles per hour beckons, you can wind the cut-off back to 15 to 20%. Sound the whistle for sheer joy. Wave at children sitting on line-side fences. Sing the theme tune from Casey Jones, if over 40 years old. Increase cut-off to maintain speed on climbs, close the regulator and open the blower a bit when running down hills. Hills in railway terms are the faintest of inclines. 1 in 125 is the gradient of the notorious climb over Shap on the Lancaster and Carlisle Railway and is considered a mountain. But again, you will feel them in your marrow. A tunnel. Warn the fireman to close the firebox door. Entering the tunnel at speed can cause a high-pressure blowback through the chimney, which could fill the cab with blazing meteors of coal. Feel the steady thrum of your mount reverberating around ancient brickwork still stained with the soot of other locomotives long passed away. Feel the coal dust from the tender swirling round your face and grinding your eyeballs. Work the tender water spray. 2 yellow lights mean only the next 2 sections are clear, and there may be a red after that. Now the automatic warning system sounds a hideous klaxon, and its display turns to the black and yellow daisy pattern, and you must acknowledge it within 2.7 seconds by pressing the silver lever on the right of the box. If you fail to do this, the system will assume you have died or fallen out, and emergency braking will be applied automatically. Then your passengers will be showered with champagne and small pieces of meticulously prepared amuse-bouche from large and otherwise empty plates, and will want a refund. Close the regulator, open the blower, coast down to 40 miles per hour, applying gentle train braking if required. If you see a single yellow next, then only one section is definitely clear. Reduce to 25 miles per hour and be ready for the red. If it's green, full steam ahead. Increase cut-off, open the regulator, exhort your fireman to sate the craving in the raging belly of the monster. Eventually, you will have to stop completely at Grantham. Do this progressively, remembering that as the train slows, the braking requirement diminishes. Work the handles subtly, aiming to reduce braking to nothing as the whole thing comes to an absolute stop. Now put all the brakes on, set the reverser to mid-gear, and cook bacon on a shovel heated in the firebox while the tender is refilled. You know how to pull away now. Smile from the cab window in a relaxed and confident way. Not much happens in Grantham, so the platforms will be full of railway buffs with cameras. Once, their work might have turned up decades later as a grainy snapshot in World of Steam magazine. Today it will be on YouTube within hours, complete with any unwarranted blasphemy. Onwards then, to York, a hub of our great railway heritage and home to the world's greatest railway museum, from which other great engines sometimes steam forth: Stephenson's rocket, Flying Scotsman, Oliver Cromwell, City of Truro, legends all, marking their passage into the present with beautiful white plumes in the sky, just as you are doing. With your hand on the regulator, you are a conduit for the wisdom of a dynasty of engine drivers stretching back to Richard Trevithick. Listen to them. Listen to your living locomotive. It will seem happy when you have the settings right and will pant like a well-exercised dog. Get it wrong and it will huff and puff like a stroppy platform luggage porter. And as you pull up in York, to cheers and adulation, take a moment to reflect on the change that has come over you. You have crossed a line dividing your life into 2 distinct parts, that time when you had never driven a steam locomotive, and this new age of man, when you have.